It's a Sunday morning in April of 1969 in a quiet small town south of Valencia in Franco's Spain. In a handsome villa on Santa Ana Street, Don Vicente Perez Garcia was being served his mid-morning coffee. His son had already delivered his Sunday morning paper and went off to church down the street for Mass, letting his father know that he'd go play with friends afterwards, but would be back in time for lunch. The printing company located on the ground floor was closed for the weekend, but stacks of newspapers were waiting to be shipped around the world. As he was preparing lunch, Don Vicente's young cook heard cries coming from the living room. "Help! I'm feeling unwell." Don Vicente was stumbling around the living room, vomiting profusely. The poison clearly wasn't working. The cook helped Don Vicente into the kitchen, positioning him over the sink where he continued to vomit. The young man reached for the hammer that he had been carrying with him as a backup and swiftly hit Don Vicente in the face.
Word.
"Ustasha, motherfucker. This is how you kill children in Jasenovac. Now you know what's coming for you." After countless blows from the hammer, he stabbed Don Vicente half a dozen times for good measure and dragged his limp body into the master bedroom, wrapping it in a carpet. The cook quickly cleaned up the vomit and blood from the kitchen and living room and finished preparing lunch. When his son came back from church, the young cook informed him that his father had business to attend to in a nearby town and would return in a few days. They ate lunch together along with another family friend and listened to records before retiring for the evening. When the workers of the printing press arrived the next morning, they were surprised to find their boss was nowhere to be found. When they went looking for him upstairs, they found the blood-soaked carpet. Upon unraveling the body, they were shocked to see Don Vicente's face caved in beyond recognition.
Damn.
Don Vicente was, of course, not actually Don Vicente. He was known by many names: Maximiliano Soldo, General Ladislav Drinjanin, Ladislav Chernovsky Snoveda, and of course, his true identity, Vyacheslav Max Luburić, the Croatian Himmler, founder and commandant of the independent state of Croatia's vast network of death camps.
Ooh. This one sounds dark. Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray.
Yo.
And a pretty bloody introduction today. Damn.
Yeah, so if y'all didn't already realize, we're going to be talking today about Vyacheslav Max Luburić's group, Croatian National Resistance, or just Resistance. And
I guess the contents of his sink, which is a mix of skull and brain, I guess. Damn.
Well, he cleaned it up, and they had lunch there afterwards. His son didn't apparently suspect a thing. It's quite crazy.
Ice cold.
It's interesting to me, though, how much Luburić's group, out of the ones we've talked about so far, managed to remain, I guess, relevant and carry on without his leadership. I mean, they're the guys behind the most high-profile attacks committed by Croatian terrorists during the Cold War, all the hijackings, assassination, extortion, all that stuff that we might not even get to today. But what you heard in the cold open is pieced together from several different accounts, including the one from the alleged assassin himself, although he would go back on it some years later. And somehow his actual account is far more brutal than what I described.
Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like absolutely insane. Like it's like
gruesome.
Like not just the hammer, he's like, I should have gotten the iron bar, that's what he needs. And like
yeah.
like describes the hammer going into the head and pulling it out and hitting him again and again and again and again and again. What most people agree on is that it was done by this guy, Ilya, sometimes also written as Ivan Stanic. What they don't seem to agree about is what his motivation was to kill Luburić. On the one hand, it's alleged that he was contracted by the Yugoslav secret police, which seems pretty likely. And on the other, it was described as an internal conflict among Ustashas, which is what the CIA thought at the time when they wrote about Luburić's death. I suspect that both are kind of true, and it has to do kind of with the background of the assassin. So this guy, Ilya Stanic, was born during World War II in Bosnia to a father who was a diehard Ustasha. by the name of Vinko Stanic. And Vjekoslav Max Luburić was his godfather at his christening.
Oh.
So after the war, his father was among the Crusaders, who we talked about, these kind of like the stay-behind Ustasha units that continued to wage a guerrilla war against the Yugoslav government. And he, along with most of the other Crusaders, was liquidated in the years following World War II.
That's Ilya's father.
Yeah, that's Ilya's father.
All right.
Now, according to some sources, Ilya never forgave the Ustashas for having his father killed. And really, after getting into some trouble as a kid, he was recruited by the Yugoslav secret police to use his familial connections to get close to Luburić.
Uh-huh.
So whether or not
sense.
he was... Yeah, totally. I mean, whether or not he was contracted by UDBA or if it was a personal vendetta, he did, emigrate to Spain, where Luburić was located, and spent nearly 3 years warming up to him and gaining his trust.
I mean, it sounds that he was recruited. Like, not a lot of people do things like that on their own. Like, move to Spain and infiltrate someone for 3 years.
Although Pavelić's assassin also did that, right? I mean, he went to Argentina, lived there for a few years. I mean, people had personal vendettas.
Although that guy was also a part of a organization in some sense. Like,
right.
Yeah.
The reason why I say it's up for debate is that he later went back on it. Like, when you read Ustasha sources, they of course say that, like, he was rewarded with an apartment in the most elite part of Belgrade and a Mercedes and all that stuff. That doesn't necessarily seem to be true, because from what I can understand, he lived the rest of his life in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and then also fought in Bosnian army during the war, which also kind of led him to change his story a little bit.
Yeah.
So, we don't know exactly 100% what his motivation was. I'm pretty sure that the Yugoslav government contracted him.
I mean, what did he say later on? Like, did he deny that he killed him, or just that he worked for the state security, or what?
It depends on when. Kind of both.
Okay.
But I mean, he gave really graphic accounts, and I mean, it was pretty well known even at the time that it was him. I mean, he fled Spain immediately afterwards. He was Luburić's cook. He was the guy that was there and had lunch with his son and another Ustasha that came over for lunch and, then subsequently disappeared. I mean, he almost definitely did it, right?
Yeah.
That's
just who was he doing
I just want to
for?
savor how fucking crazy that story is for a minute. Just that this dude had a cook. The cook was, like, probably contracted by the state. The cook bashes his head in a sink, cleans up the mess because he's probably used to cleaning up kitchen messes. Pretty good at it. Rolls a proficiency with that, and then ties up his boss in his own bedroom while his son and who else?
Some other Ustasha that lived in Spain.
All right, but both these people, familiar with him. While this dude is rotting in the bedroom, these guys are having lunch that the murderer made for them.
Yes,
that's just fucking wild.
Like the account is like insanely brutal. Like it's really over the top and ridiculous. And I mean, he did fucking cave his face in with a hammer. It's brutal stuff.
I wish he had said something like some line like, I don't know, like
well, I mean, he called him apparently an Ustasha motherfucker.
Well, yeah, but I thought something more like a cook would say, like dinner's ready, asshole, or
I think
something like
cook
that.
Wasn't his primary occupation. I mean, I think he was like generally an assistant to the Luburić household, which included like making coffee, which he put poison in that didn't work.
Yeah.
And was like, oh, this is shitty poison. That always seems to happen.
Yeah.
And so, he had to resort to the hammer and the knife because I guess he was stabbed a bunch of times.
Which is appropriate since a hammer was often an Ustasha weapon of choice, I guess.
Right. And it is impressive. I mean, it makes sense that Luburić eventually trusted him. I mean, he knew him since he was a child. He was his godfather, all this other stuff. But I mean, Luburić at the time was deeply paranoid. He knew that people were after him. He knew that the Yugoslav Secret Service was after him. But he also thought that Pavelić's guys were still out to get him too.
So was he paranoid or was he right?
I mean, he was right, but he was also like intensely paranoid. I mean, he was always intensely paranoid.
Yeah.
So I guess we should get to that now, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, who is Max Luburić? He's come up many times on the show, from our early Ustasha episodes, even to our Thompson episodes. Where
never good things.
Never good things. Thompson was recorded singing songs praising Jasnowitz and Max's Butchers, which is a term he uses favorably, by the way. And it occurred to me that we never did a proper bio on the guy, and he's really like one of the true monsters of the show and like of the 20th century. I mean, just like a real like guy that's defined by his like cruelty, his psychopathy, having, I guess, like the hands-on sadism of someone like Mengele, but with like the institutional power of like a Himmler or an Eichmann or something like that. Which is why they called him both the Croatian Himmler and the Croatian Eichmann, depending on who you read.
Yeah.
So Vjekoslav Luburić was born in Herzegovina in 1914 in a small village that's relatively close to the city of Mostar. And his hatred of the Yugoslav state and Serbs in particular came at a young age when his father was killed in a shootout with Yugoslav police, which was reportedly a result of his involvement in a cigarette smuggling ring. This area of the country is well known for its tobacco production and the like. And I guess his dad was a cigarette smuggler.
Yeah.
By Luburić's own account, he said that he hated having to learn in school that these Serbian peasants were responsible for, quote, liberating Yugoslavia, and that he was upset that they didn't teach him about Croatia's glorious history. And of course, it's kind of a pretty big jump to go from there to wanting to exterminate every man, woman, and child of Serbian origin.
Yeah.
But here we are. These are the kinds of people that we talk about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so as a very young man, he dropped out of school and quickly got involved in like the Croatian nationalist movement and the kind of fledgling Ustasha movement. He spent most of his 20s in the Ustasha training camps that we talked about back in Arc 2.
These are now 1930s, right?
1931 is, I think, when he left, and he spent most of his time in Hungary at the camp that they had in Hungary.
Okay.
Actually bouncing between a couple of the camps in Hungary, but was mostly there. And then, of course, when World War II starts, he returns to Croatia as, of course, a diehard, emigree Ustasha, but one that didn't have a particularly high rank. He wasn't some important guy at the time. Now, as we know from our Ustasha episodes, the new government immediately set up concentration camps, but it was only following the death of the previous officer in charge of the camps who, died in a skirmish, I believe with partisans, that Luburić was selected to establish this new network of camps based on the German model. And so in early 1941, Luburić is sent to Germany and as a guest of the Gestapo takes tours around various concentration camps to learn how to, replicate the model in Croatia. And he did that. He was faced with this kind of monumental task of finding the final solution to Croatia's like nearly 2 million Serbs and like all their Jews.
This, of course, includes all of the whole of Bosnia, right? So
right. Yeah. It's modern day Croatia, all of Bosnia, and parts of northern Serbia, going all the way to Belgrade, basically. So again, this is a rather short biography, but he becomes the newly appointed commander of Bureau 3 of the Ustasha Surveillance Service, which puts him in charge of all of the Croatian, all the concentration camps, including the newly established and most notorious Jasenovac death camp. Of course, he had kind of already proved his worth before this, commanding these kind of death squads that were sent around different parts of Croatia to, neutralize the partisan threat, which basically just meant killing civilians. And he, excelled at that.
He excelled at killing unarmed people.
Yeah, and by literally every
Bully
single
for him.
account. Yeah. No, but like literally every single account, like he really relished in taking like a personal hand in killings, which kind of sets him apart from, like other Nazi officers who like let other people do that kind of stuff. I mean, he took a really hands-on approach.
I started this episode with this, when you told that fucking story, with this feeling like, oh, that, oh, it's so gruesome, it's so awful. But, honestly, it wasn't enough, man. Like, the hammer, he's right. He should have got the iron bar out. But he should have fucking, what he should have done is fed this dude to his kid. He should have gone, like, all the way.
Yeah, I guess, lunch he was already preparing lunch. Otherwise, I guess he could have, sliced and diced and thrown him in the pot, I guess.
Yeah. It's prosciutto.
Yeah, I mean, if you read any kind of survivor accounts of any of the camps that they operated, pretty much all of them talk about the fact that killings would increase when Luburić came to visit a specific camp, right?
Was that when you had like the horrible fucking contests and shit? Is that some Luburić
oh yeah, I mean,
thing?
There are a million different accounts of like the crazy shit he did. I mean, like on one example, like he came to a camp and told the prisoners, addressed the prisoners, that he had interrupted his Christmas holiday to come and address issues of unsanitary and poor conditions in the camp. And he told the prisoners that they would be now transferred to a new camp where the conditions were better. And so when all these prisoners lined up and were, leaving the camp, they were met by Luburić himself and a bunch of other Ustashas with machine guns who mowed down like hundreds of them. This is the kind of thing that he was doing. Even like there's an account of a former Ustasha guard at one of the smaller camps who was like, when certain soldiers were, say, expressing reservation about killing women and children, he told them that, we are at war with the Serbs, Jews, and communists, and that, of course, no sympathy could be shown, and then personally slit the throats of several women to set like an example of what they should do.
Yeah, fuck this guy.
Yeah.
Tell the story again, Boris, of the hammer in the sink.
The vomiting into the sink and then getting your
yes,
head completely smashed in with a fucking hammer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Continue.
So by the middle of World War II, the Germans actually kind of had to rein him in, and
never.
Of course,
good.
that's
when the Nazis are reining you in. That's
because they definitely didn't do it out of like humanitarian concerns, but like as we talked about in Arc 2, they were really desperately trying to organize the chaos of the Ustasha state and make them into a viable fighting force because they were losing tons of territory to the partisans and
all they wanted to do was Holocaust, really.
Yeah, and also Luburić had a paranoid penchant for executing other Ustashas that he saw as disloyal, and I guess that was causing some trouble for the German war effort because he was killing guys in elite units and stuff like that that he didn't think were
and it wasn't going well for them anyway. Like, so it's probably
So Pavelić was then forced to put him under house arrest, although it seems like that was kind of a formality. They appointed new commanders to the camps, but like from what I can tell, he was still able to like exert kind of considerable control over the day-to-day activities in the camps, despite being in under house arrest. He really liked that position, so I guess he was able to do what he wanted, but he couldn't go around and kill people personally. At least not until the end of the war.
Okay.
When Pavelić again releases him and sends him to Sarajevo to do a couple of things. One was to drum up support with the Bosnian Muslim Ustashas, which he had a pretty good track record with. When him and Pavelić split, a lot of the Muslim Ustashas went with Luburić, kind of because of his, like, I don't know, unconditional support for like a non-divided Bosnia. So he had some, support there. But what he really did there was also just terrorize civilians. And that's like pretty well documented. Like all he did in 1945 was just like terrorize the people of Sarajevo. So, the war comes to an end. And as we mentioned a couple episodes back, he was appointed as one of the commanders of these Crusader stay-behind units. Again, like I said then, it's not super clear how much he was actually there, what kind of command he actually had over those guys. Because by 47, he was definitely able to leave Yugoslavia. And of course, he used typical rat lines to first go to Italy and then, disguised as a Catholic priest, travel through France and then into Spain.
Yay, Vatican.
Yay, Vatican, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he arrives in Spain as a Catholic priest with a different name, but also still has his Ustasha papers. And I guess already had some connections with the Franco estate.
So this guy was really not worried about anybody coming for him at this point. I mean, if he's carrying around his papers that whatever immediately contradict his identity that he's showing, presumably to like police and whatnot, he just clearly doesn't care. Like he's very confident at this point.
No, not at all. And we'll see this now with his Nazi wedding, which is, I guess, what, our
oh god damn it, again
Nazi wedding?
What the fuck? All right.
We've had quite a few on the show. So when he gets to Spain, he settles in close to the French border. I think first in San Sebastian and then in Bilbao, and quickly marries a wealthy Spanish countess, who is close to the regime. And like I said, despite living under a false identity and several false identities, at his wedding, he paraded his Ustasha, whatever, nature very proudly.
He had some peasants executed?
Well, yeah. He at this wedding, and there are pictures of it, he appears in a full Ustasha general's uniform with all of his medals, including, the Iron Cross that he was awarded by the Germans for, I guess, killing Jews or whatever. And, proudly his cross of King Zvonimir, which kind of also looks like something between an Iron Cross and a Canadian maple leaf. It's a weird kind of symbol. And, he writes about this quite openly in letters to his followers, right? So he is using a different name, but at his wedding, he's in Ustasha uniform. It's very clear who he is.
Man, just smash cut to the fucking Yaki saying that like post-war Nazis were just persecuted by the West in every way. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this guy's wearing his Iron Cross at his wedding.
Yeah, amazing.
This guy commanded a network of death camps and is just, walking around.
He's not anymore, therefore he's persecuted.
Right.
Right.
And I mean, he is in Franco's Spain, which, I guess is a pretty good place to be if you're a Nazi.
Yeah.
So, he
or an anti-pope.
Or an anti-pope. Yeah.
You could be anything in Franco's Spain.
It's true. And later, King Zog and all those people were there. And
yeah.
Really interesting mix.
Totally. It was like entourage for like the post-war fascist right,
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Parties every day.
He marries this super wealthy woman, this countess, and fathers 2 children with her. She actually manages to divorce him a few years later, by most accounts, because he was a fucking psychopath and crazy person. And like even other Ustashas were warning her. This is around the Pavlić Luburić split. Like Pavlić's wife was like, that guy's fucking crazy.
Well, I love this idea now that like he didn't tell her he was gonna wear his Ustasha uniform to the wedding. Like, she picked out some fucking tuxedo for him and shit, and he just shows up with this Iron Cross.
Yeah. But I guess since she was super wealthy and well connected, that like served him pretty well. Like he was able to, during their marriage, use a lot of her money to like establish a printing company that he would, continue until his death. Even other Ustashas sometimes would like make fun of him. Like when the split happened, they were like, oh, he's just relying on his wealthy wife and all this other bullshit. And I guess he did get some money out of the settlement too when they split up. I'd imagine divorce actually wasn't super common in super Catholic Franco Spain. So
if you're rich, though, you can do whatever the fuck you want, right?
I guess so, yeah. But yeah, he got some money out of it and served him pretty well. So now he's in Spain. He's a guy who entered the war with kind of bona fide Ustasha credentials, but like I said, with no real rank to speak of. And he leaves the war as a general, whatever the fuck that means.
Right.
But he's, even though he's a member of what we called the Old Guard a couple episodes back, he has a significant advantage over the rest of his, I guess, comrades, and that is his age. He's significantly younger than most of the rest of the Old Guard. So by the time he splits with Pavelić in the mid-50s, he's only 40 years old, compared to Pavelić, who's 20-something years older, who's in his 60s, and all these guys are aging.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess his relative youth and uncompromising reputation ended up serving him pretty well. And I think this is largely why his organization was much more successful with the quote unquote new generation, and was able to carry on after his death in 1969. So his new organization, which he formed after he splits with Pavelić, that we talked about a couple episodes back, proved to be a much more, like I said, formidable foe because of their willingness to adopt new ideas and tactics. And so structurally, the organization took a much more decentralized approach than, say, Pavelić's organization, or Jelić's organization, or any of the other post-war Ustasha groups. And this isn't exactly like a leaderless resistance model that later neo-Nazis would adopt, but it's kind of similar. So they would use pre-existing Ustasha extremist networks that he inherited from the Pavelić split. So the guys that went with him stayed with him, and they were still there, and they still had their propaganda networks, and they were established, like I said in a couple episodes back, on pretty much every continent on Earth, right?
Uh-huh.
They're in Australia, they're in North America, South America, Middle East. So that network kind of served as a base, and primarily kind of for propaganda purposes and a little bit for coordinating. But in general, individuals were encouraged to form small cells and guerrilla units that would kind of work independently of one another while still kind of adhering to the core tenets of the movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you could basically, if you were a Croat who wanted to do terrorist shit in North America, you and a couple buddies could form a cell, call yourself, Resistance, Croatian National Resistance.
Right.
And of course, you'd be in contact with the local chapters, the guys that are publishing the newspapers and the like, but you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. And their general mission statement even was very open-ended and up for interpretation. So, Luburić, I'm going to quote Luburić real quick, and I took this from a Yugoslav era book, which I was just mentioning to you guys before the show, has some very problematic language about Luburić.
Yeah.
They were his mongoloid appearance made him not like women and not be favorable to the opposite sex, and that's why he was a particular sadist against women in the concentration camps. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
But in general, it is a pretty good resource, and so they have this quote by Luburić. Our position is clear. The destruction of every Yugoslavia will destroy it with the Russians or the Americans, with communists or anti-communists. Destroy it with anyone who is willing. We'll destroy it with words and dynamite, but its destruction must be unconditional, because if there's a state with no right to exist, then it can only be Yugoslavia.
Okay.
So again, this is pretty open-ended. It's words or dynamite. You can, pick and choose, do whatever you want.
This might be off topic, but how did they decide it doesn't have a right to exist? What's their philosophy of the right of a state to exist? Why doesn't Yugoslavia qualify?
Well, because Croatia has an inherent right to statehood.
Oh, they just called dibs.
And they taught him. They didn't teach him about Croatian history in school enough, I guess.
Right.
I mean, a lot of this like Croatian like old school nationalism was based around this idea of like national rights or rights to the state. I mean, the main nationalist party was called Croatian Party of, like, how would you call it? Of right or rights?
Of rights, yeah.
So in it referred to historical rights that the Croatian nation had. So
Right.
yeah.
But that was backed by what, like Zvonimir's connections or something?
I think the whole idea, I think we talked about it a little bit. Of course, it had different interpretations. You know, not all of the nationalists who were into this were Ustashas or developed into Ustashas, but it was based on this idea that in the Middle Ages, I think the medieval Croat state. I mean, of course, we mentioned many times that medieval states are not really states in the modern sense, especially not national states, but in their interpretation it had some sort of a deal with the Hungarian medieval state about, I guess, having a common monarch or something like that. And then this later was transferred to Austro-Hungary.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some like almost, when Austrian Empire became a dual monarchy, it was Austro-Hungarian. So it officially was consisting out of two nations, let's say. So the Austrian emperor was at the same time a Hungarian king, and Hungary had its own government and so on. But there was almost a kind of a second duality inside of Hungary, where you had Croatia recognized as a separate kingdom, basically.
Right.
Okay.
With its own parliament and so on. And it was recognized even like in the, I think, Schönbrunn Palace in like Vienna. They were in front of it, which was like the summer palace of the Habsburg dynasty or something, of the emperor. There was, an Austrian flag in front of it. There was a Hungarian flag, but also a Croatian flag.
Right.
Croatia was seen as a kind of a nation, let's say. So I think that, are some remnants of this idea. So Croatian nationalism in the 19th century was based on this. They saw Croatia as a nation because it had rights to be so. So it is. Even if the reality doesn't always recognize it as such, they have historical, almost like natural rights to be a nation. And therefore Yugoslavia doesn't, because it occupies the same territory.
Uh-huh.
Right. And they kind of oscillate between what you just explained as like this concept of continuous statehood, right? That they were always a relevant factor and always maintained a kingdom. But then at the same time, when the independent state of Croatia is established in 1941, they say, this is our first state since, 11 something or rather.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they kind of go between those two. But, the fundamental idea is that like they are a race that's destined to have a state and rule. I mean, in the kind of Ustasha Nazi ideology of that.
I mean, they would probably say it's their first independent state. Like, this is also why, the independent state of Croatia had that word independent in it. But I think they would probably, I'm not sure, but they would argue that, even though they didn't have an official independent state, they were a kind of a natural nation throughout history, or something like that.
Yeah, and like a proud nation of rulers, as opposed to, I mean, Luburić, when he talks about like his, being in school and having to, learn from the curriculum of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, he refers to like the Serbs as, basically as like peasants, as people that don't have a right to rule, right? This is, I mean, we talked about this in Arc 2. And of course, Pavelić's first political party when he comes to Argentina is that like states' rights party, right? The right to the state party. Which is calling back to that. But what you can see from like that kind of mission statement of his is this kind of open-endedness that has one primary goal, and that's Croatian statehood. And in kind of contrast to previous organizations or other organizations, Ustash organizations at the time, your original political background didn't really matter that much, right? And this is something that would be really important for them recruiting this new generation. In many ways, they, like I said, were adapting and taking cues from like emerging national liberation movements that were happening all around the world at the time, right? We're talking about like the late 50s, early 60s, throughout the 60s, and they really take this on later on. I'm also kind of curious maybe what role, Gladio activities had in influencing some of this. I mean, there's nothing written about that I could find, but like it does come to mind, right?
Sure.
It is kind of similar in that way. And this fascist terrorism.
Yes.
So,
but I also kind of feel like if anybody didn't need to be part of Gladio to do shit like that, it's these guys.
Absolutely, totally.
Fucking maybe Angleton showed up and was like, "Listen, here's what I need you to do," and they were like, "No, this is what I need you to do, dude."
Yeah. I commanded death camps. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think Boris pointed out this way back that Ustashas were primarily a terrorist organization. They were founded as such in the 30s.
Right.
So
it's kind of all they were ever able to do.
Yeah.
Even as a state, they were just a terrorist organization.
Yes.
Really.
Right. Yeah, and so this is going back to the roots. And of course, Luburić, like I said, is young, but also has the experience of the 1930s, right? Which, he's learning from his mistakes in some ways, which is, horrible and terrifying. So what is the new generation? I know I mentioned it, at the beginning of this kind of Croatian sub-arc, that there was kind of an old guard and a new generation.
Can I just say how mad I am right now at Pius the fucking 12th for the fact that there is a new generation? Like,
well, yeah, I mean, you can blame him, I guess, for is that like because of the rat lines? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
New generation of these guys. Thanks. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, CIA. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for letting, Pavelić, Luburić, Artuković, everybody escape and establish themselves and,
awesome.
around the world.
Great idea.
Do whatever they want. Yeah.
If there was one group we needed a second generation of, it was definitely these guys.
Definitely Ustashas, yeah.
God damn it.
But it is an interesting question, right? How is it that, Pavelić dies, Luburić dies, the old guard dies off, and yet there's an uptick, like a really increased terrorist activity in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Why is that? We talked about this before, but the old guard's base of support largely came from people who left Yugoslavia immediately after the war for more or less political reasons, right? Whether they were Ustasha supporters, or, for example, members of the Ustasha regular army, recruits that feared reprisals, or were, anti-communists. In general, all of those people were decidedly against living in like a communist Yugoslavia, right? So that was their base of support in, immediately after the war and through the 50s, recruiting in these displaced persons camps, like the Chetniks did as well, that we talked about earlier in the SARC. By the 1950s, and especially the 60s, the face of the emigre community began to change a lot in a very major way. And this new wave of immigrants to Western countries were largely coming for economic reasons, right? And not for political reasons. So, the 1950s in Yugoslavia were pretty difficult. And like a lot of young people, including many people whose, say, parents might have been partisans or party members or whatever, were leaving the country to seek a better life in obviously more economically prosperous countries. And as the 50s and then in the 60s, as socialist Yugoslavia's relations with Western countries improved, this number dramatically increased, namely with these bilateral agreements, for example, with West Germany in 1968 that included Yugoslavs into the guest worker program, known as, Gastarbeiter in Germany. And this is, of course, like in the 60s when they started to import workers from places like Turkey and Yugoslavia and other countries that would come there and work. And this was beneficial, obviously, for the Yugoslav state because it allowed cold, hard cash to come in through remittances, and it was a mutually kind of beneficial situation for both countries. So kind of ironically, Yugoslavia's good relationship with Western countries allowed a lot of young people to be exposed to these extremist nationalist emigres that had established themselves in the 40s and 50s. And, people from all ethnicities obviously went to the West to work. Serbs, Croats, Macedonians, people were going to all these countries. But in places like West Germany, a lot of it was kind of disproportionately Croat. It came from like really kind of impoverished regions, and a lot of them were moving to Germany, but were like in general kind of either ambivalent or apolitical, at best. They weren't particularly interested in, signing up for any particular cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would be wrong to say that they were like, impressionable young minds that were just waiting to be molded by these evil guys.
Sure.
Abroad. That's not really how it went.
They were just like regular okay people.
Yeah, regular okay people. You're going to fucking work in a factory in Germany. You're, move to the U.S. so that you can be a fucking waiter in New York. That work in a steel mill, that kind of thing. You don't particularly care about politics. You just, want to have a life and make money and do whatever. So like, yeah, sure. Like on the one hand, the propaganda worked on some people, right? Like, we talked about this many times before, but like, various different Croatian nationalist groups operated their own networks of clubs and cultural organizations and, newspapers and the like. But guys from Luburic's group Resistance often resorted to very strong-arm tactics, some of which are really, clearly borrowed from the mafia.
Okay.
And so, of course, we're talking about, protection rackets, intimidation, extortion, and these were things that were actively encouraged in their texts. They would write, when we talk about like the structure of the organization, how it was kind of decentralized, they did publish like handbooks on how to be a guerrilla, right? And this included stuff like how to make bombs, how to sabotage, this, that, and the other thing, but also like, how to extort people, how to, use violent, strong-arm tactics to get what you want, right? Taxing the people and all that kind of stuff. So this played out in different ways in different countries, but, it does kind of take on this classic, like, bunch of big guys walk into like a Croatian-owned cafe, and it's like, nice place you got here.
Yeah, wouldn't want anything to happen to it. Yeah.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be firebombed. Here's a stack of Ustasha newspapers and, kick up some money to the fucking boss, that kind of
Fuck.
And, in the case of them having to deal with pro-Yugoslav emigre organizations, they often just employed straight up violence. That tended to be how they did things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'll, to kind of show how this played out on the ground, I'll use an example of another guy named Vjekoslav, different one. This guy, Vjekoslav Radović, who is a guy who was born of mixed Croatian and Serbian parents, who immigrated as a young man to the United States in the 1950s. And although he was like, primarily an economic migrant, the way that you'd get into the U.S. back then is saying that you were an opponent to Tito's regime. And, they were roughly. I mean, by his account, they didn't like the government that much. They wanted to go somewhere else and make money and start new. So, this guy comes to New York City and is working odd jobs and gets kind of connected to the more pro-Yugoslav elements in the emigre community, the guys that we talked about in the beginning of the arc, right? Which, still existed in the 50s, although not in the same capacity as they did before. And so, like, after a few years of living in the U.S., he starts his own radio program called the Yugoslav Radio Hour in New York City, where he'd play, contemporary Yugoslav music, do interviews here and there, that kind of thing. And it really picked up. It became very popular with, people from Yugoslavia in New York City, to the point that it attracted a lot of negative attention from these pro-Ustasha emigres in New York. And primarily these guys that were, members of Croatian national resistance and tied to the Catholic Church. The Croatian Catholic Church has a very big center in Manhattan, big church, big community center, which was known as this kind of area of like kind of Croatian extremist activity. And so they pick up and start their own radio show on the same network called, The Voice of Free Croatia, or or something like
okay.
that. And it's
the usual.
It's basically and it's basically funded by the Croatian Catholic Church and all that. So this guy Radović is running this Yugoslav program. It's very popular, and he's constantly getting death threats, right? Constantly getting death threats from all these guys. And leaving the station one night, he gets beaten half to death by a bunch of guys who it is assumed to be members of Croatian National Resistance. Of course, he's hospitalized. He names the guys that beat him up. And when he goes on trial, a Catholic priest comes and provides an alibi for the guys, and they get off scot-free. So worked out pretty well for them. But not for him. So, he continued running his radio show. And at some point in the 70s, later in the 70s, he's accosted in Times Square and shot multiple times by a guy who he later identifies as Miro Barisic, who I think we'll talk about a lot more in the next episode. Very famous Croatian National Resistance figure, like a hero in his hometown. I think he has a statue.
Did you say he
today in Croatia?
Sorry, did I hear you right? Did you say he got shot on Times Square?
Yeah, he got shot on Times Square was different in the 70s.
Damn.
I mean, I know. I listened to him retell the story, and he's, he got shot multiple times, and then tried to flag a taxi, bleeding, and fuck you.
God damn.
And it was only because there was like an ambulance driving by at the time that like he was able to survive. Spent a lot of time in the hospital recovering and the like. What's interesting about this guy is that he later he recovers from his wounds. He later moves back to Yugoslavia and becomes a journalist for the state agency Tanjug, and returns to the U.S. in the late 80s to, cover, diaspora stuff. And he meets Father Kajević in Detroit in the late 80s, who told him that he was also on a Sopo hit list.
Oh.
Yeah. He's like, oh, I can't believe you're here. We were planning on killing you.
But, actually, I probably should be right now, but I don't have my stuff with me.
But Croatian National Resistance obviously got to him first.
Yeah,
they lit him up.
The Sopo guys were just not that serious, huh? About like often targets.
Yeah, I guess not. These guys were way more serious. So there's interestingly not a whole lot written about that particular encounter, that attempted murder, other than by this guy himself. Except for some stuff that I dug up that the firearm that was used was later possibly tied to a murder that did happen, a successful murder of a pro-Yugoslav pediatrician in Vancouver, who was also assassinated, his wife alleges, by Croatian National Resistance because he was like a prominent pro-Yugoslav figure and was in contact with the Yugoslav government about setting up a consulate in Vancouver. And he was, killed leaving a YMCA in 1977 in Vancouver. And like the case is still officially unsolved, right? But the weapon that was used was connected in both this like attempted murder and this murder in Vancouver. So it's very likely that it was either the same person or definitely like the same network of people, right?
Yeah, you're right.
And, at the time, the Canadian and U.S. borders were pretty porous, too. So, like, these guys were moving back and forth. Guys in Canada, for example, were, it was easier to procure dynamite, for example, in Canada, I guess, than it was in the U.S. And they would smuggle that across the border, and these guys would, use dynamite purchased in Canada for their various, mail bombs, bombing Yugoslav consulates, that kind of stuff. But from this example of Radović, you get kind of a feeling of what that looked like on the ground, right? So, like, you did a thing, they didn't like it, they come beat you up. When that doesn't work, they kill you. And there are some, there's another, like, interesting case, too, from the early 1980s. I mean, this was a case that was building throughout the 70s, and these guys were indicted in the 1980s, where 6 members of Croatian National Resistance were convicted of RICO charges, which, to people unfamiliar with U.S. crime codes, that's something that is reserved for organized crime, right?
Yeah.
And kind of pretty much destroyed the mob, right? I mean...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to the U.S. government, the activities of Croatian National Resistance in the U.S., fit the mold for RICO charges, right? Because a lot of what they were doing was racketeering, extortion, and of course they had connections to the actual mob. And like, okay, so these 6 guys were indicted on a huge list of crimes. I mean, huge. Some of it is, of course, racketeering of Croatian-owned businesses in Chicago, LA, Cleveland, stockpiling dynamite, arson of several places, including a Yugoslav social hall in San Pedro, California, people's houses. We'll get to that in a second. What is interesting, of course, and I think that's probably what jump-started maybe some of the RICO investigations, is that they were connected to 2 very well-known mafia hitmen from Chicago by the names of Joe Neary and Luis Almeida. Now, one of the guys that was based in Chicago had contracted, he had made connections through other Croats to these figures in the Chicago mafia, and contracted these guys to kill the leader, the head of the Croatian Fraternal Union, John Badovinac in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
So, these guys were given, I think, one of them was given 10, the other $20,000. A lot of fucking money in the 70s to go take this hit on Badovinac. So these guys drive to Pittsburgh, can't locate the guy, decide to drive back to Chicago and report that, like, they couldn't kill the guy, they couldn't find him, whatever. This seems to be something that happens to them when they try to contract killings in Pittsburgh. It happens more than once. And of course, these 2 hitmen get pulled over somewhere in Ohio on their way back to Chicago with a car full of guns and money and all this stuff. And of course, they immediately snitch on the guys that contracted them. And it turns out that they're these guys from Croatian National Resistance. Now, these same 6 guys continued their vendetta. So they weren't immediately indicted. I think that's when the federal government began the investigation. And their primary target were other Croats. So Croats that were associated with the Croatian Fraternal Union, people that they deemed to be moderate or not sufficiently for the cause of Croatian independence, were their main targets. So to these guys, they would send letter bombs. On a notable occasion, and this is to me very funny because I read this in an official U.S. government document, a court document. They try to go back to Pittsburgh to kill another high-ranking officer in the Croatian Fraternal Union, or firebomb his house, rather. And they get there, they come from Chicago, and they can't find the guy's house, and are just like driving around town. They can't find the address, and they end up firebombing the wrong house. And
so they didn't even know which house it was. They were just like, this one is
they couldn't find it for a while,
house.
and they were like,
let's just do this one.
Okay, this looks enough like it. I think this is the address, and they just firebomb this fucking random person's house.
I mean, this sounds like a Sopo action, I have to
say.
It does sound like a Sopo action.
Too. Yeah.
The U.S. government, or the federal prosecutors or whatever, described it as, and I quote, "This series of misadventures in Pittsburgh seems reminiscent of an Inspector Clouseau-style bumbling. Unfortunately, tragedy soon replaced what appeared to be a comedy of errors."
Oh, man.
Luburić and Bagarić, undaunted, continued their private war, taking new soldiers along.
Oh, okay. But nobody died in this firebombing, I guess.
Nobody died in this firebombing.
Okay, so it's funny. Yeah.
Yes. But they did kill people. And so one of the ways that they would, like racketeer people is that, like, say you were an ethnic Croat businessman, own a business or whatever, even if you were just like an individual person that they didn't like, they'd send you a letter, right, saying, send 1,000 or whatever sum of money to a P.O. box in Paraguay, and we won't, bomb your business, kill you, whatever. And it was largely actually successful. And they even extorted Catholic priests, which is pretty crazy too. Like the Catholic priests that weren't on the like whole Ustasha thing. Yeah. They sent like fucking letter bombs to them as well. But they, and this is of course not even the most high profile Croatian national resistance stuff. This is, real low level stuff. But they placed a bomb in the UN that was diffused, which is a pretty big deal, but again, still not on the rank of some of the other things. And did commit a couple murders. Like there were 3 or 4 people that were killed and connected to this case. And of course, you know, this investigation went on for a very long time. 1983 is when they were convicted. And it was pretty cut and dry. Like they had witnesses, they had snitches, they had all this information, including like, you know, quotes from the guys about what we need to bomb and which Croats we need to kill and all this kind of stuff. You know, very straightforward case. But during the trial, one of these idiots decided to give a speech in his defense, in which, of course, he cites Martin Luther King. Like,
awesome.
Like any white person that wants to somehow earn favors with people in the U.S.
Oh man,
it's like I'm basically doing what Martin Luther King did. You know, like, I'm fighting for the rights of my people who are, you know, enslaved by communism.
Yeah, like by firebombing florists and stuff. Yes.
Yeah, by like extorting local businessmen and having them send money to Paraguay and you know, murdering people, contracting mob hitmen to
just
kill.
like Dr. King.
Yeah, just like Dr. King.
Also,
Totally.
I'm a fascist, but yeah.
Yeah, also I'm a Nazi. But these bumbling idiots and murderers were part of this younger generation. So almost all of them at the time of their activities were quite young, right? They had come to the U.S. as like new immigrants that were in 20s and 30s. I think some of them were even born in the U.S., which is kind of a different story. But a vast majority of them had come in this like new wave economic migration, and then subsequently been radicalized by, you know, these existing Ustasha networks.
Yeah.
It's a bad sign that like in a RICO case where you're like being convicted of murder and all these dudes like went in for like 20 plus years.
Yeah.
That they describe something that you did as a comedy of errors.
Yeah. Doesn't look good on your permanent record there. You don't want that on your resume, terrorist.
I mean, there's enough on those guys to just like do 10 episodes about them. But I think this is probably a pretty good place to stop before we get into the real like nitty gritty of the some of the more high profile stuff, like the hijackings and the bombings. The one bombing, which maybe Croatian National Resistance did, was one of the largest terrorist attacks pre 9/11, and killed like 11 people. So we'll see about all that next week. But yeah, these guys are serious business. They really are something between a guerrilla organization and the mob.
Yeah, very, very much more mob-like than I expected. I mean, kind of indistinguishable in a lot of ways.
Yeah, especially when it comes to like, you know, extortion, racketeering, and all that kind of stuff.
They were a mob with politics, I guess.
Yeah, which I mean, I guess a lot of guerrilla organizations in the 60s did this kind of stuff. But, you know, these guys were Nazis as opposed to, you know, like the left-wing guerrilla groups that they kind of modeled themselves after.
Right, yeah.
And, you know, I couldn't help thinking when I was reading about some of this stuff that this is exactly what, like, the later incarnations of the American Nazi Party wanted to be.
Right.
But absolutely couldn't do, right? Like, model themselves after this, like, kind of nationalist guerrilla units and stuff like that. These, like, independent cells that are coordinated by, like, a, you know, central propaganda body. And of course, they couldn't pull it off, but these guys definitely did. And, you know, this is just the stuff that was happening. Like the two examples I gave were from the US and Canada, right? But the situation in West Germany was absolutely nuts. Because, and like, it's too much to even cover in this arc because, first of all, I don't read German, so it makes it a lot harder to research some of the stuff. But like these, like bombings and killings by members of the Croatian National Resistance, and of course killings by the Yugoslav secret police were a regular occurrence in West Germany in the 60s and 70s. Like in some places, it was like a straight up war zone. You know, there'd be like, you know, drive-bys and bombings like every couple of weeks. You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean that's a whole different story. In the U.S., it was a little bit more toned down. Australia gets pretty crazy, but we'll talk about that a little bit later because Croatian National Resistance kind of has offshoots. specifically this kind of Croatian Revolutionary Brotherhood, which is based in Australia, and I think we'll do maybe a Patreon episode about them. We're like really hardcore extremists and really into terrorism. And, you know, all of these groups were accused of being riddled with infiltrators from the Yugoslav secret police, and that they had like, you know, provocateurs and the like. And that's probably true to a certain extent. But with a lot of these guys, they didn't really need provocateurs. They were, you know, kind of wild enough on their own. And I think like the kind of mafia aspect speaks to that. I think that a lot of them had some sort of kind of personal motivation as well. Like, you know, incentive, financial incentive to like, you know, extort people. Of course, it's for the cause, but they're making money along the way.
Win-win.
Yeah. And I think if we're going to compare it to something like Sopo, it's way more widespread and way better organized.
Sopo, of course, is the Serbian anti-communist terrorist group that we did a bunch of episodes on.
Yeah, who also came from this kind of new generation, right? People born either after the war or were very young.
Yes.
You know, not this like pre-war generation.
You wanted to compare them with Sopo?
Yes. I did compare them to Sopo.
There's no comparison. There's way
They're way
less
more
sombreros. They never went to Mexico. Maybe they did go to Mexico. Were they out in Mexico trying to kill commies?
No. But South America will figure pretty heavily in the next episode. Croatian national resistance had one state supporter, and that was Paraguay.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that more next week. So they go to South America. They don't go to Mexico. They go to South America. And, you know, despite like the seriousness of some of their actions, like, you know, this was a comedy of errors. In a report I read about one of the hijackings that happened in the 70s, they write about how it was mixed with bumbling humor.
Okay.
In that, like, they didn't really know what the fuck they were doing. Kind of similar to Kavaya's hijacking.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I didn't hear a lot of drinking in these stories so far. I mean, I'm going to assume that there was. Seems like...
they don't write about it as much.
It wasn't as focused on the alcohol as Sopo was.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Luburić was too busy drinking people's blood. I don't know.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Busy guy, that Luburić.
Yeah, so I mean, Luburić dies 69. It's the 60s, baby. But his legacy carried on. And still to this day, there's a fucking retiree in Austin, Texas, who keeps like the Croatian National Resistance name alive. He runs some sort of blog and posts pictures of himself with like a portrait of Luburić and
fucking Texas.
These guys are still around. They're still assholes, basically. Although I can thank that guy because he published that book of Luburić's correspondences that I used a lot for my research. So,
hey, all right.
I guess we can thank him for that.
Thank you, Texas, for being the haven for so many freaks that we need.
Yeah,
to keep the show running. Yeah,
from Luburić guys to, you know, satanic Sith lords,
satanic Waffen guys. Yeah, all up and down the chain.
What's the next episode? The next free one?
The next free one is Croatian National Resistance Part 2, The Glory Years. We'll talk about all their big actions and all the big names.
Great.
Yeah.
The biggest actions and the biggest names in the Neo-Ustasha movement here on Tenepod.
That's right.
All right.
Now play us out with Hammer Smash Face.
in honor of Luburić.
Or maybe don't, because there might be some copyright issues there.
All right, listeners, go to YouTube, load up Hammer Smash Face, play us out.
And think of Luburić.
Yeah. Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Later.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people.
But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.